If you've ever felt like you're constantly trying to balance stability with meaning, like you want security, but also don't want to feel stuck, like you think carefully before making decisions, but still question them afterward, that tension isn't random. It shows up a lot in people born between 1981 and 1996. Because being a millennial isn't just about growing up at a certain time. It's about what your mind had to adapt to while you were forming your identity. You grew up during shift, not as sudden as some generations, but not stable either. You were told to follow a path. Study hard, get a degree, build a career. That structure was clear. But at the same time, the world around you kept changing. Technology evolved. Job markets shifted. Expectations moved. So you learned to plan, but also to question the plan. And that creates a very specific kind of thinking. You might notice it in small ways, like overthinking decisions that seem simple to others. Not because you're indecisive, but because you're trying to choose something that will actually last. You don't just think about what works now. You think about what it might mean later. And that kind of thinking comes from uncertainty. Not dramatic uncertainty, but a quiet, ongoing sense that things don't stay the same for long. So your mind tries to stay prepared. It weighs options. It replays outcomes. It looks for the right choice, even when there isn't one. And from the outside, it might look like hesitation. But internally, it's your system trying to create stability in a world that didn't always feel stable. That's not weakness. It's adaptation. You might also notice how you relate to work. There's often a push for meaning, not just survival. You don't just want to have a job. You want it to feel aligned, or at least purposeful. And when it doesn't, something feels off, even if everything looks fine on the surface. Because part of your identity was shaped around the idea that work should mean something, that it should reflect who you are. But at the same time, you've also seen how unstable that can be. Layoffs, burnout, shifting industries. So there's this quiet contradiction. You want meaning, but you also don't fully trust stability. And that creates tension. You might stay in something longer than you want, while also thinking about leaving, or constantly reassess whether you're on the right path. Not because you're never satisfied, but because your mind was shaped to question direction. It also shows up in how you connect with people. You value depth, real conversations, emotional understanding, authenticity, because you grew up in a time where connection wasn't always immediate. It had to be built. But you also adapted to a world where connection became instant. Messages, notifications, social platforms. So now there's a contrast. Part of you wants meaningful connection. Another part is used to constant access. And that can create a strange experience. You might feel connected, but still disconnected. Present, but slightly elsewhere. Engaged, but also mentally processing. And here's where it gets interesting, but the real reason isn't what most people think. It's not about confidence. It's about responsibility. You were raised in a way that made you feel responsible for your choices, responsible for your future, responsible for getting it right. So your mind doesn't treat decisions lightly. Even small ones can feel like they carry weight, because somewhere in the background, there's a belief that your choices define your direction, and your direction defines your life. So you think more, you analyze more, you hesitate more, not because you're unsure of yourself, but because you've learned that outcomes matter. And that creates another layer. Emotional awareness. You're often aware of how things feel, not just how they look. You notice when something is off, in work, in relationships, in yourself. And that awareness can be both helpful and heavy, because once you notice something, it's hard to ignore it. So you carry that awareness with you. And over time, that becomes part of your identity. Someone who thinks deeply, someone who questions, someone who doesn't just accept things at face value. But there's also a quieter side to it. You might notice a tendency to compare, not always intentionally, but subtly, where you are versus where you thought you'd be, what you've built versus what others seem to have, because you grew up alongside visibility. Seeing other people's lives became normal. So your sense of progress isn't just internal. It's constantly being reflected back at you. And that can create pressure, not loud pressure, but a quiet sense of, am I where I should be, even when things are going fine? And that question doesn't always have an answer. So it stays in the background, influencing how you see yourself, how you evaluate your life, how you move forward. And over time, all of these patterns connect. The overthinking, the need for meaning, the questioning, the awareness, the comparison. They're not separate traits. They come from the same place. A mind shaped during transition. A system that learned to balance structure and change at the same time. That learned to plan, while also adapting, to care about direction, while knowing it might shift. And that creates a very specific kind of identity. One that doesn't fully settle, but also doesn't fully drift. It stays somewhere in between, adjusting, reevaluating, moving forward carefully. And once you start to see that, a lot of things begin to make more sense. Why you think the way you do, why certain decisions feel heavier, why stability and meaning both matter, but don't always align. It was never random. It was shaped by timing, by expectations, by a world that didn't stay still long enough for one clear path to exist. And that awareness changes how you see yourself, not as someone who overthinks, but as someone who learned to think in a world that kept changing. Not as someone who is unsure, but as someone who understands that certainty isn't always guaranteed. And once you see it, you can't really unsee it. If this explains something you've noticed in yourself, there's always more beneath the surface. Because understanding yourself is where everything starts.